Good evening and welcome back. Tonight we're embarking on a journey through time to one of humanity's most remarkable civilizations. As always, let me know where in the world you're listening from. Get comfortable, settle in, and let's explore the entire story of the Babylonians. Between two rivers, in a land where the sun beat down mercilessly and water meant the difference between life and death, there rose a civilization that would shape human history for millennia to come. The Greeks called this place Mesopotamia, the land between rivers, though to those who lived there it was simply the world, the center of all existence. The Tigris and Euphrates, flowing from the mountains of Anatolia down to the Persian Gulf, carved through an otherwise unforgiving landscape, bringing with them the gift of fertility in a region where rain was scarce and unpredictable. Imagine standing on the flat alluvial plain of southern Iraq today. The horizon stretches endlessly in every direction, broken only by palm trees and the occasional ruin of an ancient city. The summer heat is crushing, often exceeding 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Dust storms rise without warning, turning the sky orange and reducing visibility to mere feet. Winter brings rain, but not enough to farm without irrigation. This is harsh country, unforgiving to those unprepared for its challenges. Yet it was here, in this seemingly inhospitable environment, that humanity first learned to build cities, to create kingdoms, to write, to calculate, to organize complex societies. It was here that civilization began. This is where our story begins, not with Babylon itself, but with the world that gave birth to it. To understand the Babylonians, we must first understand the deep roots from which they grew. Roots that extend back more than 5,000 years into the shadowy prehistoric period, when writing itself was being invented. Long before the great ziggurat of Etemenenki rose above the plains, before Hammurabi carved his laws in stone, before Nebuchadnezzar built gardens that would become legend, there were the Sumerians. These remarkable people, speaking a language unrelated to any other known tongue, created something unprecedented in human history. They built cities. Not small settlements, mind you, but true urban centers with populations in the tens of thousands, with specialized craftsmen and merchants, with temples that functioned as economic powerhouses, with social hierarchies and organized labor forces. They created, in essence, civilization as we understand it. Around 5,000 years ago, in what we now call the Uruk period, after the greatest of these early cities, settlements like Uruk, Ur, Eridu, and Lagash transformed from simple farming villages into true urban centers. Uruk alone may have housed 40,000 people at its peak, an almost incomprehensible number for that era. To put this in perspective, most human beings at this time still lived in small farming communities of perhaps a few hundred people at most. Cities of thousands were revolutionary. Cities of tens of thousands were miracles of organization. What made this possible? The answer lies in those two great rivers and in human ingenuity. The Tigris and Euphrates flooded annually, bringing nutrient-rich silt from the mountains. But unlike the Nile in Egypt, whose floods were predictable and gentle, the Mesopotamian floods were violent and unpredictable. They came at the wrong time for farming, in late spring when crops needed to be ripening, not drowning. The solution was irrigation, an enormous system of canals and channels that captured floodwater, stored it in basins, and released it when and where farmers needed it. This required organization on an unprecedented scale. Canals had to be dug, maintained, and controlled. Disputes over water rights had to be settled. Labor forces had to be coordinated. Someone had to be in charge. And so arose the temple complexes, which weren't merely religious centers but became the organizing principle of early Sumerian society. The priests didn't just commune with the gods. They allocated labor, distributed rations, adjudicated disputes, and managed the economy. The temple owned vast tracts of land worked by dependent laborers. It stored grain in enormous warehouses. It employed scribes to track everything, every sheaf of barley brought in as offering, every jar of beer distributed as rations, every plot of land assigned to a farmer. Tens of thousands of people lived within their walls, supported by an agricultural system that tamed the rivers through an intricate network of canals and irrigation channels. The Sumerians didn't just farm, they innovated at every turn, solving problems with remarkable creativity and persistence. They developed the world's first writing system, pressing wedge-shaped marks into clay tablets to keep track of grain stores, temple offerings, and commercial transactions. What began as simple accounting marks, pictograms representing physical objects, evolved over centuries into cuneiform, a sophisticated writing system capable of expressing everything from mundane receipts to profound poetry, from mathematical calculations to passionate love songs. Imagine the process. A scribe, trained from childhood in the complex art of writing, sits cross-legged in a temple scriptorium. Before him lies a lump of clay, carefully prepared to the right consistency, neither too wet nor too dry. In his hand, he holds a reed stylus, cut to a specific angle. He presses the stylus into the clay at precise angles, creating wedge-shaped impressions. Each cluster of wedges represents a sound or an idea. He's recording the delivery of barley to the temple storehouse, noting the amount, the date, the name of the farmer who delivered it, the name of the official who received it. This tablet, once dried or baked, will become permanent, a record that can be consulted years or even centuries later. Thousands upon thousands of such tablets accumulated in temple archives, creating what were effectively databases in clay, information storage systems that allowed these complex urban economies to function. But writing soon transcended mere accounting. Scribes began using it to record literature, creating some of humanity's first great works of fiction and poetry. They wrote down myths explaining how the world came to be, how the gods created humanity to serve them and relieve the gods of labor. They composed hymns praising kings and gods. They recorded proverbs capturing practical wisdom. They wrote love poetry that sounds remarkably modern in its emotions, expressions of longing and desire that any person today could understand. One famous Sumerian love song, written for King Shusin over 4,000 years ago, describes the beloved as being like honey, sweet and intoxicating. These weren't primitive people groping toward expression. These were sophisticated thinkers and artists working in the world's first written language, creating literature as profound as anything that would come later. The scribes themselves formed an elite class. Literacy was difficult and rare. Learning cuneiform required years of study, memorizing hundreds of complex signs. A fully educated scribe might know not only Sumerian but also Akkadian, the Semitic language that increasingly dominated Mesopotamia. He would study mathematics, able to perform complex calculations. He would learn astronomy, tracking the movements of stars and planets. He would master law, able to draw up contracts and resolve disputes. Scribes served as accountants, lawyers, teachers, astronomers, and administrators. They were indispensable to the functioning of civilization, and they knew it. Their status was high, their skills valued, their expertise sought by both temples and palace. These city-states were independent kingdoms, each ruled by a lugal or king who served as the earthly representative of the city's patron deity. The temple, the ziggurat rising in stepped platforms toward the heavens, stood at the heart of every Sumerian city. These weren't merely places of worship, but economic powerhouses, controlling vast tracts of agricultural land, employing hundreds of workers, and functioning as banks, schools, and administrative centers. The priests who served in these temples weren't just religious figures, but scribes, mathematicians, astronomers, and bureaucrats who kept the complex machinery of urban life running smoothly. But city-states, by their nature, competed. They fought over water rights, over boundaries, over prestige. Epic battles were waged between Lagash and Umma over a fertile plain. Kings commissioned monuments celebrating their victories, and for centuries, Sumer remained a patchwork of rival powers, none able to dominate the others for long. That is, until an outsider changed everything. Sargon of Akkad rose to power around 2,300 years before the Common Era. His origins remain somewhat mysterious, though later legends provided colorful accounts. Some stories claimed he was found as a baby in a reed basket floating in the river, rescued and raised by a gardener, tales that may have been created to legitimize his non-royal origins or to link him to divine favor. Whether these stories contain kernels of truth or were entirely invented by later generations to explain how a commoner rose to kingship, we cannot know for certain. What we can say with confidence is that Sargon, despite coming from outside the traditional power structure and speaking Akkadian rather than Sumerian, proved to be one of history's great conquerors. Speaking Akkadian, a Semitic language utterly different from Sumerian, he unified the competing city-states under his rule through a combination of military might and administrative genius. For the first time, Mesopotamia knew a true empire, stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. The Akkadian Empire didn't erase Sumerian culture. Instead, it absorbed it, creating a fusion that would define Mesopotamian civilization for the next 2,000 years. Akkadian scribes continued to write in cuneiform, borrowing the Sumerian script for their own language. They worshipped Sumerian gods under Akkadian names. They preserved Sumerian literature, copying ancient texts and creating new works that blended both traditions. This cultural synthesis became the foundation upon which all later Mesopotamian civilizations, including Babylon, would build. But empires, even great ones, are fragile things. The Akkadian Empire lasted barely a century and a half before collapsing under pressure from invasions, internal rebellions, and possibly climate change that brought devastating drought to the region. Sumer briefly experienced a renaissance under the third dynasty of Ur, which controlled southern Mesopotamia around 2,000 years before the Common Era. This period saw a flowering of art and literature, including the composition of some of Mesopotamia's greatest literary works. But it too would fall, this time to invaders from the east called the Elamites, and pressure from Amorite peoples pushing in from the west. In the chaos that followed, a new center of power began to emerge. A small city on the Euphrates, previously of little importance, started to grow in influence. Its name was Babylon. The word itself may have meant Gate of the Gods, and in time it would become the greatest city in the ancient world. But that transformation didn't happen overnight. It took ambition, cunning, warfare, and the rise of one of history's most famous lawgivers. The city of Babylon existed long before it became important. Archaeological evidence suggests settlement at the site going back perhaps 4,000 years, but for most of its early existence, it remained overshadowed by older, more prestigious cities. That changed with the arrival of the Amorites, a Semitic-speaking people who had been migrating into Mesopotamia for generations. Around 1900 years before the Common Era, an Amorite dynasty established itself in Babylon, and the city began its rise to prominence. The early rulers of this first dynasty of Babylon were capable kings who gradually expanded their territory through conquest and diplomacy, but they remained relatively minor players in a region crowded with competing powers. Cities like Isin, Larsa, Eshnunna, and Elam all vied for dominance. Babylon was simply one voice in a chorus, not yet the soloist. Everything changed with the ascension of Hammurabi to the throne around 1792 years before the Common Era. He would rule for 43 years, and during that time he would transform Babylon from a regional power into the dominant force in Mesopotamia. But Hammurabi's greatness didn't lie in battlefield prowess alone, though he was certainly a capable military commander. His true genius lay in patience, strategy, and the understanding that power came not just from the sword but from law, administration, and the projection of divine authority. For the first decades of his reign, Hammurabi played the patient diplomat. He formed alliances, carefully avoiding direct confrontation with the more powerful kingdoms around him. He invested in Babylon's infrastructure, strengthening its walls, dredging canals, building temples. He cultivated his image as a pious king favored by Marduk, Babylon's patron god, and the other deities of the Mesopotamian pantheon. He waited, watched, and prepared. When Hammurabi finally moved against his rivals, he did so with devastating effectiveness. One by one, the great cities fell to Babylonian arms. Larsa, which had dominated southern Mesopotamia, was conquered. Eshnunna, a powerful kingdom to the north, was defeated. Even Mari, a wealthy city far up the Euphrates with which Hammurabi had once been allied, was conquered and destroyed when it suited Babylon's interests. By the end of his reign, Hammurabi controlled virtually all of Mesopotamia, from the Persian Gulf to the Syrian border. But conquest was only part of Hammurabi's legacy. What truly set him apart, what made his name resonate through the millennia, was his code of laws. Near the end of his reign, around 1750 years before the Common Era, Hammurabi commissioned a black stone stele, nearly 7.5 feet tall and made of basalt, on which was carved one of history's most important legal documents. At the top, A bas-relief showed Hammurabi standing before Shamash, the sun god and god of justice, receiving the laws directly from the divine, establishing that these weren't merely the king's personal edicts but divine will made manifest. Below this sacred scene, in tightly packed columns of cuneiform script covering the front and back of the stone, stretched 282 laws covering virtually every aspect of Babylonian society. These laws addressed everything you can imagine and some things that might surprise us. There were laws about property disputes, establishing clear procedures for resolving conflicts over land ownership, about boundary markers and irrigation rights, critical issues in an agricultural society. There were family laws covering marriage, divorce, inheritance, and adoption, laws that, in many ways, protected women's rights to a degree remarkable for the ancient world. A woman could own property, she could engage in business. If divorced through no fault of her own, she could claim her dowry back. If her husband died, she inherited a portion of the estate for her maintenance. These weren't feminist ideals by modern standards, certainly, but they were far more protective of women's rights than many later legal systems would be. There were laws regulating commerce and trade. The code established standard prices for various goods and services, set maximum interest rates on loans at 20% for silver and 33% for grain, reasonable by ancient standards, and prescribed punishments for fraud and theft. A merchant who tried to cheat a customer by using false weights faced penalties. A builder who constructed a house so poorly that it collapsed faced consequences proportional to the damage. If the house fell and killed the owner, the builder would be executed. If it killed the owner's son, the builder's son would be executed. If it killed a slave, the builder had to provide a replacement slave. This may seem harsh to us, but it established clear accountability in an age when such standards were often arbitrary or non-existent. Professional standards were also addressed in remarkable detail. Physicians had their fees set by law depending on the social status of the patient and the complexity of the treatment. A successful surgery on a noble's eye merited a payment of 10 shekels of silver. The same operation on a commoner earned 5 shekels, on a slave 2 shekels. But these fees came with risks. If a physician operated on a noble's eye and destroyed it, the doctor's hand would be cut off. If he set a broken bone badly and the patient ended up crippled, similar punishment awaited. These harsh penalties reflected both the high stakes of ancient surgery and society's need to ensure that professionals took their responsibilities seriously. Agricultural workers had their wages specified. A field laborer earned 8 gur of grain per year, a standard measure that other employers had to meet or exceed. The code protected against exploitation, though it also reflected a highly stratified society where different social classes received different treatment under the law. The code distinguished between 3 main classes: the Awilim or free citizens, the Mushkenim or dependent workers, and the Wardim or slaves. Punishments and compensations varied by class. An injury to a noble required greater compensation than the same injury to a commoner. This inequality offends modern sensibilities, but at the time, it represented a step toward systematic justice, replacing the arbitrary will of local strongmen with publicly known standards. Some of the laws give us fascinating glimpses into daily Babylonian life and the problems people faced. There's a law addressing what happens if a man's wife becomes ill and he wants to take a second wife. He may do so, the code says, but he must continue to support his first wife as long as she lives, a protection against abandonment. There are laws about adoption, establishing that an adopted child who discovers their birth parents can't simply repudiate their adoptive family. There are laws about renting boats and oxen, about the wages of shepherds and the responsibilities of innkeepers. One law famously prohibits a tavern keeper from accepting payment in grain rather than silver, a measure apparently designed to prevent tax evasion since taxes were calculated in silver. Reading through the laws today, we can glimpse not just the legal concerns but the social anxieties of Babylonian society. Several laws deal with accusations of witchcraft, reflecting real fears that malevolent magic could harm people. The accused could prove their innocence through trial by ordeal, throwing themselves into the river. If they survived, they were innocent, a grim but accepted method of divine judgment. There are laws about slaves trying to escape, about slaves denying their masters, about the price of buying a slave's freedom. These remind us that Babylonian society, like virtually all ancient societies, was built partly on unfree labor, a fact that can't be overlooked even as we admire other achievements. The Code of Hammurabi wasn't the first law collection in Mesopotamian history. Earlier Sumerian law codes had existed, including those of Ur-Nammu and Lipit-Ishtar, but Hammurabi's was the most comprehensive and the most famous. It was copied and recopied by scribal students for centuries, becoming a classic text for learning both law and the Akkadian language. Hammurabi hadn't just created a legal code, he had created what might be called a constitution, a foundational document that expressed his kingdom's values and aspirations. In the prologue, he declared his purpose in grandiose but sincere terms. He had been called by the gods, he said, to bring about the rule of righteousness in the land, to destroy the wicked and the evildoers, so that the strong should not oppress the weak. Whether he fully achieved this goal is debatable, but the aspiration itself was revolutionary. The idea that a king's first duty was to establish justice for all his subjects, not merely to conquer and accumulate wealth. Hammurabi didn't just want to rule Mesopotamia, he wanted to transform it into a unified state with Babylon at its heart. He worked tirelessly on administration, appointing governors to oversee distant cities, establishing a courier system that allowed messages to travel quickly across his empire, creating a bureaucracy of scribes and officials who could implement his policies. He promoted Marduk, Babylon's local god, to a position of supreme importance in the Mesopotamian pantheon, beginning a religious transformation that would eventually see Marduk recognized as king of the gods, displacing the older Sumerian deity Enlil. The king personally involved himself in the details of governance to a remarkable degree. Letters survive in which Hammurabi instructs officials on matters both large and small, from military deployments to the dredging of specific irrigation canals. He presented himself as a shepherd of his people, a righteous king who brought order and justice to the land. In the prologue to his law code, he declared that he had been called by the gods to bring about the rule of righteousness in the land, to destroy the wicked and the evildoers, to prevent the strong from oppressing the weak. Under Hammurabi, Babylon experienced a cultural flowering. The city grew larger and wealthier. Its temples received lavish gifts. Scribes copied ancient Sumerian texts, preserving them for future generations while also creating new works in Akkadian. Mathematics and astronomy advanced, building on Sumerian foundations. The Babylonians developed a sophisticated understanding of mathematics, using a base 60 number system that still influences how we measure time and angles today. They tracked the movements of planets and stars with remarkable precision, recording observations that would later influence Greek astronomy. But empires built by great men often struggle without them. When Hammurabi died around 1750 years before the Common Era, his son Samsu-iluna inherited an empire already showing strains. The southern cities, which had been conquered and never fully reconciled to Babylonian rule, rebelled. A new power called the Kassite Dynasty established itself in the marshes of the far south, and despite Samsu-iluna's efforts, he couldn't dislodge them. The empire Hammurabi had built began to contract. For about a century and a half after Hammurabi's death, his dynasty continued to rule in Babylon, but their power gradually diminished. The great empire fragmented. Then, around 1595 years before the Common Era, disaster struck. The Hittites, a powerful people from Anatolia in what's now Turkey, launched a lightning raid down the Euphrates. They sacked Babylon, carrying away its treasures and destroying its temples. The shockwaves from this attack destabilized the region completely. The first dynasty of Babylon, Hammurabi's line, came to an end. But Babylon itself would survive and eventually thrive again under new rulers. The city's fate was about to be taken over by a people who would dominate it for more than 4 centuries, preserving and adapting Babylonian culture while putting their own stamp on it. These were the Kassites, and their long reign would prove that Babylon had become more than just a city. It had become an idea, a cultural center whose importance transcended any single dynasty. The Kassites remain one of the more mysterious peoples of ancient Mesopotamia. They appear to have originated in the Zagros Mountains, the rugged highlands east of Mesopotamia in what's now western Iran. Their language, known from personal names and a few inscriptions, seems unrelated to any other known language family. They had been present in Mesopotamia for some time before they took power in Babylon, probably arriving as migrants, mercenaries, or traders. But in the chaos following the Hittite sack of the city, The Kassites saw an opportunity. Around 1530 years before the Common Era, a Kassite ruler named Agum II claimed the throne of Babylon. Unlike the Hittites, who had simply raided and left, the Kassites came to stay. They would rule Babylon for roughly 400 years, making their dynasty one of the longest lasting in Mesopotamian history. What's remarkable about the Kassite period is not military conquest. They never built a vast empire like Hammurabi had, but rather cultural continuity and adaptation. The Kassites didn't try to impose their own culture on Babylon. Instead, they became Babylonian. They adopted the Akkadian language for administration and inscriptions. They worshipped the traditional Mesopotamian gods, building and restoring temples, presenting themselves as pious servants of Marduk and the other deities. They preserved and copied the ancient texts, including Hammurabi's law code. In essence, they understood that to rule Babylon, they needed to become Babylonian, to position themselves as legitimate heirs to a tradition stretching back to the Sumerians. Under Kassite rule, Babylon entered a period of relative stability after the turbulence of the previous centuries. The city was rebuilt and beautified. A new palace rose, and the great temples received attention and resources. The Kassites introduced new artistic styles, particularly in sculpture and glyptic art, the engraving of cylinder seals. These seals, small cylinders of stone carved with intricate designs that could be rolled across wet clay to create a distinctive impression, were used to mark ownership and authenticate documents. Kassite period seals show a distinctive artistic style, blending traditional Mesopotamian motifs with new elements. But perhaps the most significant development of this period was Babylon's emergence as a major player in the international diplomatic system of the Late Bronze Age. Around the 14th and 13th centuries before the Common Era, the ancient Near East was dominated by a club of great powers: Egypt, the Hittite Empire, Assyria, Mitanni, and Kassite Babylon. These kingdoms corresponded with each other, their letters preserved in the archives of Tel El Amarna in Egypt, revealing a sophisticated diplomatic world. The Kassite kings exchanged letters with the pharaohs of Egypt, addressing each other as brother, a sign of equal status. They arranged royal marriages, sending princesses as brides to cement alliances. They exchanged lavish gifts: gold, lapis lazuli, precious stones, elaborate furniture, horses, and chariots. These weren't merely presents, but carefully calculated diplomatic signals, displays of wealth and power designed to maintain prestige and establish hierarchy within this international system. Babylon during this period was wealthy, perhaps not as militarily powerful as Egypt or the Hittites, but economically prosperous and culturally prestigious. The city's scribal schools were renowned. Babylonian scholarship was respected throughout the region. The Akkadian language, in its Babylonian dialect, became the lingua franca of international diplomacy. Kings from Egypt to Anatolia corresponded in Babylonian cuneiform. This cultural influence extended Babylon's soft power far beyond the reach of its armies. The Kassite economy was complex and sophisticated. Agriculture remained the foundation, with the irrigation systems maintained and expanded to support barley and date palm cultivation, the twin staples of Mesopotamian agriculture. But trade also flourished. Babylon sat at the crossroads of several major trade routes, and merchants brought goods from distant lands: cedar wood from Lebanon, copper from Cyprus, tin from the east, precious stones from Afghanistan. The city's workshops produced textiles, particularly fine woolens, that were traded throughout the region. Land ownership and administration during this period were organized through a system that granted estates to high officials and military officers in exchange for service. These estates, called kuduru in Akkadian, were marked by boundary stones carved with elaborate symbols representing the gods and featuring long inscriptions detailing the grant. These kuduru stones are among the most distinctive artifacts of the Kassite period, combining legal documentation with religious iconography. The Kassite kings built extensively. One ruler, Kurigalzu I, founded an entirely new city northeast of Babylon, naming it after himself, Dur-Kurigalzu. Its ziggurat, though now in ruins, still rises impressively from the Iraqi plain, a testament to Kassite ambition. These kings also paid attention to Babylon itself, maintaining the city walls, restoring temples, and ensuring the proper performance of religious festivals that were central to Babylonian identity. Religion during the Kassite period remained thoroughly traditional. The great gods of Mesopotamia, Marduk, Ishtar, Shamash, Sin, and others, continued to receive worship. The New Year festival, the Akitu, became increasingly elaborate and important. This annual celebration, which involved the ritual humiliation and reinvestiture of the king, the recitation of the Enuma Elish creation epic that celebrated Marduk's supremacy, and a ceremonial procession out of the city and back, reinforced the connection between divine order and earthly kingship. The king ruled not by his own power alone, but as the chosen of Marduk, and he needed to renew that relationship annually. But no kingdom, however stable, lasts forever. By the 12th century before the Common Era, the Kassite Dynasty was weakening. A resurgent Assyria to the north was becoming increasingly aggressive, raiding into Babylonian territory. The Elamites to the east, who had been relatively quiet, suddenly became a serious threat. Around 1155 years before the Common Era, the Elamite king Shutruk-Nahunte invaded Babylonia, conquering the land and carrying off enormous amounts of plunder. Among the treasures taken to Elam was Hammurabi's Law Stele, which wouldn't be recovered until French archaeologists found it at Susa, the Elamite capital. More than 3,000 years later, the Kassite dynasty effectively ended with this invasion. Though remnants may have lingered briefly, Babylon entered a confused period with several short-lived dynasties competing for power. The second dynasty of Isin managed to stabilize the situation somewhat, producing one notably successful king, Nebuchadnezzar I, who ruled around 1125 to 1104 years before the Common Era. This Nebuchadnezzar, the first king to bear that name, managed to defeat Elam and recover the statue of Marduk that had been carried off, an act that greatly enhanced his prestige. But his dynasty too would eventually falter. What followed was a long, difficult period for Babylon. The Late Bronze Age collapse, a mysterious period of upheaval that devastated many civilizations around the Mediterranean and Near East in the late 12th and early 11th centuries before the Common Era, didn't spare Mesopotamia. Trade networks fractured, cities declined, writing became less common. And into this power vacuum stepped Assyria, and with its rise, Babylon's independence came under increasing threat. The relationship between Assyria and Babylonia is one of the most complex in ancient Near Eastern history. These were sibling civilizations, both speaking Akkadian dialects, both heirs to the ancient Sumerian and Akkadian cultural tradition, both writing in cuneiform and worshipping the same gods. Yet they were also rivals, competitors for supremacy in Mesopotamia. And for much of the period from the 10th century until the 7th century before the Common Era, Assyria held the upper hand. The Assyrian heartland lay to the north, centered on cities like Assur, Nineveh, and Kalhu. The Assyrians had built one of the ancient world's most formidable military machines, an army that pioneered the systematic use of iron weapons, employed cavalry alongside chariots, developed sophisticated siege techniques, and maintained a level of discipline and organization that made it nearly unstoppable. By the 9th century before the Common Era, Assyrian kings were campaigning annually, expanding their empire through conquest and terror. For Babylon, Assyrian expansion presented an existential challenge. The Assyrians coveted Babylonia's wealth, its cities, its agricultural productivity, and its trade routes. But they also felt a deep cultural respect, almost reverence, for Babylon. The city was ancient when Assyria was young. Its cultural prestige was immense. Babylonian scribes and scholars were considered the finest in the world. The great gods like Marduk and Nabu were worshipped in Assyria, as well as Babylonia. Assyrian kings wanted to control Babylon, but they also wanted its approval, wanted to be recognized as legitimate rulers of this sacred city. This tension produced a complex and often violent relationship. Sometimes Assyrian kings ruled Babylon directly, installing governors or even taking the Babylonian throne themselves. Other times they set up puppet rulers. And sometimes Babylon rebelled, refusing to accept Assyrian overlordship. These rebellions were often led by Chaldean tribes, Semitic-speaking peoples who had moved into southern Babylonia from the west and who fiercely resisted Assyrian domination. The 9th and 8th centuries before the Common Era saw repeated cycles of Assyrian conquest, Babylonian rebellion, and Assyrian reprisal. The Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser III who reigned from 745 to 727 years before the Common Era, conquered Babylonia and placed it under direct Assyrian control. His successor, Shalmaneser V, continued this policy. But when he died, his brother and successor Sargon II faced a major rebellion led by a Chaldean chief named Marduk-apla-iddina, better known from the Bible as Merodach-Baladan. Merodach-Baladan was a wily and persistent opponent of Assyria. He repeatedly claimed the Babylonian throne and maintained his resistance despite multiple defeats. The Assyrians found him infuriating and grudgingly respected him. He represented Babylonian nationalism, the desire to be free of foreign domination. He allied with Elam and other enemies of Assyria. He conducted diplomacy with distant kingdoms, famously sending envoys to King Hezekiah of Judah, an event mentioned in the Bible. Though he was eventually defeated and driven into exile in Elam, his resistance became legendary. The Assyrian king Sennacherib, who reigned from 704 to 681 years before the Common Era, faced constant problems with Babylon. The city repeatedly rebelled despite his best efforts to pacify it through concessions and shows of force. Finally, in 689 years before the Common Era, Sennacherib's patience ran out. After yet another rebellion, he unleashed his army on Babylon with orders to destroy it utterly. The city was sacked with extreme brutality. Its walls were leveled, its temples were demolished. Even the great temple of Marduk was torn down. The city's sacred statue of Marduk was carried off to Assyria. This destruction shocked the ancient world. Sennacherib's own Assyrian subjects were horrified at the sacrilege. Babylon wasn't just another rebellious city, it was holy, the dwelling place of the king of the gods. The destruction was seen as a terrible crime against divine order, and karma, it seemed, came swiftly. Sennacherib was assassinated by his own sons just a few years later in 681 years before the Common Era, his death widely interpreted as divine punishment for what he had done to Babylon. Sennacherib's successor, Esarhaddon, moved quickly to undo the damage. He began an ambitious program to rebuild Babylon, presenting himself as a pious king restoring the sacred city. Temples were reconstructed, the walls were raised again. The statue of Marduk was returned with great ceremony. Esarhaddon tried to balance respect for Babylon with maintenance of Assyrian control, a difficult tightrope to walk. When he died, he attempted to solve the Assyrian-Babylonian dilemma by dividing his realm between his two sons. The elder, Shamash-Shum-ukin, would rule Babylon as king. The younger, Ashur-banipal, would rule Assyria as emperor, with Shamash-Shum-ukin technically his vassal. This arrangement worked for about a decade, but eventually collapsed into fratricidal war. Shamash-Shum-ukin, feeling constrained by his subordinate position, rebelled against his brother in 652 years before the Common Era. The resulting civil war was devastating. Ashur-banipal besieged Babylon for years. When it finally fell in 648 years before the Common Era, Shamash-Shum-ukin died in the flames of his burning palace. The city suffered again, though not as catastrophically as under Sennacherib, but Ashurbanipal's victory was Pyrrhic. The war had exhausted Assyria and Babylon alike. The great empire was overstretched, holding together through military force and little else. Its subject peoples hated it. Its treasury was drained. And in Babylon, hatred of Assyrian domination ran deeper than ever. The stage was set for a final reckoning. As the 7th century before the Common Era drew toward its close, the mighty Assyrian Empire, which had dominated the Near East for generations, began to crumble. Decades of constant warfare, overextension, and the burden of controlling a vast, restive empire had drained Assyria's strength. The death of Ashurbanipal around 627 years before the Common Era removed the last truly capable Assyrian king. His successors were weak, facing mounting challenges they couldn't meet. In Babylon, a man named Nabopolassar saw an opportunity. He was a Chaldean, from one of the tribes that had long resisted Assyrian control. In 626 years before the Common Era, he seized power in Babylon and declared himself king. The Assyrians, preoccupied with other threats, couldn't immediately respond. Nabopolassar moved quickly to consolidate his hold on Babylonia, securing city after city and building an army. He presented himself as a liberator, freeing Babylon from the hated Assyrian yoke, restoring its ancient dignity and independence. But Nabopolassar knew he couldn't defeat Assyria alone. The empire, even weakened, remained formidable. So he looked for allies and found them in the Medes, an Iranian people who had recently formed their own powerful kingdom in the Zagros Mountains and the Iranian plateau. The Median king, Cyaxares, had his own reasons to hate Assyria. Together, these two powers formed an alliance that would reshape the Near East. The war against Assyria took more than a decade. Nabopolassar campaigned methodically, sometimes in alliance with the Medes, sometimes independently, gradually conquering Assyrian territories in Mesopotamia. In 614 years before the Common Era, the allies began attacking the Assyrian heartland itself. One by one, the great Assyrian cities fell. Assur, the ancient capital, was conquered in 614. Nineveh, the greatest city of the empire, magnificent and seemingly impregnable, came under siege. The siege of Nineveh became the stuff of legend. The city's massive walls, which ancient sources describe as being wide enough for chariots to race around their top, had never been breached. But the combined forces of Babylon and Media were relentless. They may have been aided by flooding, redirecting the Tigris River to undermine the fortifications. In 612 years before the Common Era, the walls were finally breached. The city fell. Nineveh was sacked with devastating thoroughness. Its palaces, which had been filled with the plunder of 100 conquered peoples, were looted. Its temples were desecrated. Fire raged through its streets. The destruction was so complete that the city would never be rebuilt. For centuries afterward, travelers would pass the massive mounds of rubble that covered the ruins and wonder what city had once stood there. The fall of Nineveh effectively ended the Assyrian Empire, though remnants of Assyrian resistance continued for a few more years, retreating westward toward the Euphrates and appealing desperately to Egypt for help. The Egyptians, recognizing that an Assyrian collapse would leave a power vacuum, actually sent an army north to support their former enemies. But it was too late. The final Assyrian holdouts were defeated. By 609 years before the Common Era, Assyria had ceased to exist as an independent power. The mighty empire that had terrorized the Near East for centuries had vanished, destroyed so utterly that later generations would struggle to believe the ruins they saw had once been the capitals of world conquest. Nabopolassar had achieved what seemed impossible. He had not only freed Babylon but helped destroy the greatest military power of the age. But destroying Assyria created a new question. Who would inherit its vast territories? Babylonia and Media had been allies in war, but the Near East wasn't large enough for two major powers. A division was negotiated. The Medes took the northern and eastern territories, consolidating control over the Iranian plateau and eastern Anatolia. Babylon claimed Mesopotamia, Syria, and the Levant, the rich western territories that controlled the trade routes to the Mediterranean. This meant Babylon now confronted Egypt, which had its own designs on Syria and Palestine. The Egyptian pharaoh Necho II had marched north during Assyria's collapse, hoping to claim these territories for himself. In 609 years before the Common Era, Nabopolassar sent his son, the crown prince, to deal with this Egyptian threat. The prince's name was Nebuchadnezzar, and he would prove to be one of the greatest military commanders of his age. Nebuchadnezzar, still in his 20s, demonstrated remarkable military ability. He drove the Egyptians from Syria, reclaiming the territory for Babylon. But then, in 605 years before the Common Era, while campaigning in the west, he received urgent news. His father Nabopolassar had died. Nebuchadnezzar faced a critical decision. He needed to get back to Babylon immediately to secure his succession, but he was weeks of travel away with an army. Showing the decisiveness that would characterize his reign, Nebuchadnezzar took a small group of companions and raced across the desert, covering a journey that normally took weeks in a matter of days. He reached Babylon, claimed the throne, and secured his position before any rival could act. The army followed at its own pace. Thus began the reign of Nebuchadnezzar II, who would rule Babylon for 43 years, from 604 to 562 years before the Common Era. Under his leadership, Babylon would reach heights of power, wealth, and magnificence it had never before achieved. The city would become the wonder of the ancient world, and Nebuchadnezzar would become the most famous Babylonian king, his name known even to people who knew nothing else about ancient Mesopotamia. Nebuchadnezzar was a king of multiple talents. As a military commander, he proved himself repeatedly. He fought multiple campaigns against Egypt, finally crushing Egyptian power in the Near East at the Battle of Carchemish. He campaigned in the mountains of Anatolia. He led expeditions to the Mediterranean coast and into the Arabian desert. He put down rebellions and enforced Babylonian authority across the vast empire he had inherited. And most famously in Western tradition, he conquered Jerusalem, not once but twice. The Kingdom of Judah, a small state in the southern Levant centered on Jerusalem, had unwisely rebelled against Babylonian overlordship, influenced by Egyptian promises of support that would prove empty. In 597 years before the Common Era, Nebuchadnezzar besieged Jerusalem for the first time. The city, though well fortified and situated on defensible hills, couldn't withstand the Babylonian army indefinitely. After a few months, the city surrendered. The Babylonian king showed relative restraint in this first conquest. He didn't destroy Jerusalem, but he did assert Babylonian authority in unmistakable terms. The young Judean king Jehoiakim, who had ruled for only 3 months before the city fell, was deported to Babylon along with his family, his court officials, and thousands of the upper classes. These included priests, scribes, craftsmen, smiths, anyone with valuable skills or potential to lead resistance. The number of deportees may have reached 10,000, a devastating blow to a small kingdom. Nebuchadnezzar confiscated the treasures of the royal palace and the temple, taking golden vessels and sacred objects back to Babylon as spoils of war. But he left the temple itself standing and the city intact. He installed a puppet king, Zedekiah, Jehoiachin's uncle, on the Judean throne, demanding loyalty and tribute. For a time, this arrangement held. But Zedekiah, despite the clear lesson of his nephew's fate, despite warnings from the prophet Jeremiah who repeatedly told him that resistance was futile and that submission to Babylon was God's will, was encouraged by Egypt and by optimistic prophets who promised divine deliverance. In 589 years before the Common Era, Zedekiah made the catastrophic decision to rebel, withholding tribute and entering into an alliance with Egypt. This was precisely the kind of betrayal that ancient Near Eastern kings could not tolerate. Nebuchadnezzar's response was inevitable and devastating. The Babylonian army returned, and this time there would be no mercy. Jerusalem was besieged for over 18 months, from January 589 until July 586 years before the Common Era. It was a brutal siege. The Babylonians surrounded the city with earthworks and siege towers, cutting off all supplies. No food could enter, no one could leave. Inside the city, conditions became desperate. As the siege dragged on month after month, food supplies dwindled. Famine set in. The Bible preserves grim accounts of the horrors. People eating things that normally would be unthinkable. Mothers driven mad by hunger. The weakest dying first while the remaining population grew progressively more desperate. By summer 586, with the food completely exhausted and the population starving, the walls were finally breached. Some scholars date this to 587 rather than 586, based on different calculations of the Judean calendar, but the event itself is well documented and the difference of a year doesn't change the essential facts. Zedekiah and his remaining soldiers attempted to flee under cover of darkness, escaping through a gate toward the Jordan Valley, hoping to reach the desert and perhaps eventually Egypt. But Babylonian cavalry pursued and captured them near Jericho. The king and his closest followers were brought before Nebuchadnezzar, who had established his military headquarters at Riblah in Syria, 200 miles north of Jerusalem. What happened next was calculated brutality, designed to serve as a warning to any other would-be rebels. Zedekiah was forced to watch as his sons, the princes of Judah, were executed before his eyes. This ensured that Zedekiah's line ended and that the last thing he would ever see was the destruction of his hopes and his dynasty. Then his eyes were gouged out, a punishment that served multiple purposes. It was agonizing and mutilating, marking him forever as a punished rebel. It rendered him harmless, unable to lead or fight, and it fulfilled literally the prophecy that he would see the king of Babylon but would not see Babylon itself. A darkly ironic fulfillment of what he had been told would happen. Blinded and in chains, Zedekiah was taken to Babylon, where he died in prison. Jerusalem itself faced annihilation. Nebuchadnezzar's general, Nebuzaradan, captain of the guard, was given orders to destroy the city thoroughly. The walls were torn down, making Jerusalem indefensible. The houses of the city, including the palace where Judean kings had ruled since the time of Solomon 4 centuries earlier, were burned. And most devastating of all, the temple, the house of Yahweh that Solomon had built, the center of Jewish worship and identity, was set ablaze. The building that had stood for over 400 years, that Jews believed housed God's presence, was reduced to rubble and ash. Its treasures, those that remained after the first deportation, were carried off to Babylon. The bronze pillars that had stood at the temple's entrance, massive columns named Jachin and Boaz, were broken up and hauled to Babylon as scrap metal, a deliberate desecration of sacred objects. The population suffered mass deportation. Thousands more were marched the long road to Babylon, joining the earlier exiles. The educated classes, the craftsmen, the priests, the officials, virtually anyone who might organize resistance or preserve distinctive Judean culture, were removed. Only the poorest farmers were left behind to work the land, and even that remnant would face further disruption when their leader, Gedaliah, appointed by the Babylonians as governor, was assassinated by Jewish zealots who then fled to Egypt, dragging the prophet Jeremiah unwillingly with them. This event, the Babylonian Captivity or the Babylonian exile, became one of the defining moments in Jewish history, a catastrophe that marked a complete break with the past and fundamentally reshaped Jewish identity and religious thinking. In Babylon, the exiles grappled with devastating questions. How could God have allowed his temple to be destroyed? Had he abandoned them? Were they being punished for their sins? Would they ever return home? These questions produced profound theological reflection that would shape Judaism forever. The exiles lived primarily in communities along the canal system near Babylon, places like Tel Aviv and other settlements. They weren't held in prison camps or worked as slaves. At least most weren't. They lived in their own communities, farmed land, engaged in commerce, and maintained their religious identity as best they could without the temple. Some prospered. We have Babylonian records documenting that Jehoiachin, the exiled king, received rations from the royal storehouse, suggesting he was kept in comfortable captivity. Some Jews entered Babylonian service, becoming scribes or officials, but they never forgot Jerusalem. Psalm 137. One of the most poignant pieces of exile literature, captures their grief and longing. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. On the willows there we hung up our lyres, for there our captors required of us songs, and our tormentors mirth, saying, "Sing us one of the songs of Zion." How shall we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget its skill. Let my tongue stick to the roof of my mouth if I do not remember you, if I do not set Jerusalem above my highest joy. This wasn't just poetic sentiment. This was existential crisis. Judaism up to this point had been inextricably tied to the land, to the temple, to the sacrificial system. Now all of that was gone. How could they be God's people without God's house? The response that emerged during the exile would transform Judaism. Unable to offer sacrifices, they emphasized prayer and study. Unable to worship at the temple, they developed the synagogue, a place where people could gather to hear scripture and pray. Unable to rely on the land or the Davidic king, they began to hope for a future restoration, a new David who would lead them home, ideas that would eventually develop into messianic expectation. The exile forced Judaism to become portable, no longer dependent on a specific place, and this portability would allow it to survive the next 2.5 millennia of dispersion. Prophets who had witnessed the catastrophe, particularly Jeremiah and Ezekiel, interpreted events through a theological lens that emphasized God's justice and the people's responsibility for their fate. They hadn't been abandoned, the prophets insisted. They had been punished for their sins, for their violation of the covenant, for their worship of other gods, for their social injustice. But punishment wasn't the end. Jeremiah predicted a 70-year exile followed by restoration. Ezekiel had visions of a restored temple more glorious than Solomon's, a future when God's Spirit would transform the people's hearts. These prophecies sustained hope during the darkest hours. Meanwhile, in Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar barely noticed the turmoil his conquest had caused in Jewish hearts and minds. For him, the destruction of Jerusalem was simply one campaign among many, necessary to maintain Babylonian authority and discourage rebellion. The treasures from the temple were added to those from a dozen other conquered cities. The Jewish exiles were just another group of deportees among the many peoples Babylon had conquered and relocated. He was far more interested in his building projects, in making Babylon magnificent, in ensuring his legacy would be eternal. And those building projects, magnificent indeed, are what we turn to next. The transformation of Babylon into the wonder of the ancient world. But military conquest was only one aspect of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. Perhaps more important was his role as a builder. He poured enormous resources into making Babylon magnificent, transforming it into the greatest city the ancient world had yet seen. The scale of his building projects was staggering, and the results were spectacular enough that Greek travelers who visited Babylon generations later would struggle to find words adequate to describe what they saw. The city's famous walls were one of Nebuchadnezzar's great achievements. Ancient sources speak of walls so massive that chariots could race 4 abreast along their tops. Archaeological excavation has revealed the reality. Babylon had not one defensive wall but several concentric circuits. The inner wall, called Imgur-Enlil, was more than 20 feet thick. Outside it ran another wall, Nimiti-Enlil, and beyond that an outer wall system. Towers studded these walls at regular intervals. The total perimeter enclosed an area of more than 3 square miles within the inner walls, with suburbs extending beyond. 8 great gates pierced these walls, each named for a god. The most famous was the Ishtar Gate, named for the goddess of love and war. This was not merely a defensive structure but a triumph of architectural decoration. The gate's surfaces were covered with glazed bricks in brilliant blue, decorated with reliefs of bulls and dragons, the symbols of the gods Adad and Marduk. These weren't painted but were made of glazed bricks that shimmered with color, yellow and brown animals against that vivid blue background. The effect must have been stunning, a demonstration of wealth and artistic achievement that proclaimed Babylon's glory to anyone entering the city. The Ishtar Gate opened onto the processional way, a broad avenue paved with limestone slabs and bordered by walls also decorated with glazed brick reliefs, these showing 120 lions, symbol of Ishtar, striding along in proud procession. This was the route used during the great festivals, particularly the New Year celebration, when the gods, represented by their statues, would be carried through the streets. The processional way led to the heart of the city, where the great temples stood. The temple complex of Marduk, called Esagila, was the religious center of Babylon and, in Babylonian eyes, of the entire cosmos. Here stood the statue of Marduk, probably made of gold or covered in gold leaf, before which kings prostrated themselves, and to which the other gods, their statues brought from cities across Babylonia, paid homage during festivals. The temple owned vast estates, employed hundreds of priests and workers, and functioned as a major economic institution as well as a religious one. Near Esagila rose the ziggurat, the stepped pyramid tower called Etemenanki, the house of the foundation platform of heaven and earth. This was the building that would later inspire the biblical story of the Tower of Babel. It rose in 7 stages, each one painted a different color, climbing more than 300 feet into the sky, a man-made mountain that dominated Babylon's skyline and could be seen from miles across the flat Mesopotamian plain. At its summit stood a shrine to Marduk, where, it was believed, the god might descend to earth. Nebuchadnezzar also built or rebuilt temples to other gods throughout the city and across Babylonia. He restored ancient shrines, some dating back centuries. He commissioned new construction in cities like Borsippa, where he rebuilt the ziggurat dedicated to Nabu, god of writing and wisdom. In his building inscriptions, Nebuchadnezzar emphasized his piety, his reverence for the gods, his role as the one who ensured the temples were properly maintained and the rituals properly performed. The royal palace was another of Nebuchadnezzar's great projects. The complex covered a huge area and included not only the king's residence but audience halls, administrative buildings, storerooms, workshops, and barracks. The throne room was particularly magnificent, its walls decorated with glazed brick reliefs showing lions and floral patterns in brilliant colors. This was where Nebuchadnezzar received ambassadors, where tribute was presented, where the king sat in judgment. And then there were the hanging gardens. Of all Nebuchadnezzar's building projects, none captured the imagination of later ages like the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, counted by Greek writers as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Ancient sources describe a terraced garden rising in stages, creating an artificial mountain covered with trees and plants, watered by some ingenious mechanism that lifted water from the Euphrates to the highest levels. The problem is that we're not entirely certain the hanging gardens existed, at least not in Babylon. No Babylonian text from Nebuchadnezzar's time mentions them. They don't appear in his building inscriptions, and Nebuchadnezzar loved to list his architectural achievements. Archaeological excavation hasn't definitively identified their remains. Some scholars have suggested the gardens might have been in Nineveh, built by the Assyrian king Sennacherib, and that later Greek writers confused the two cities. Others argue they were in Babylon but were a later addition, built after Nebuchadnezzar's time. Yet the tradition persists, and it's possible Babylonian sources didn't mention the gardens simply because they were a private pleasure attached to the royal palace rather than a public religious building. The story goes that Nebuchadnezzar built them for his wife, a Median princess named Amytis, who missed the green mountains of her homeland and found the flat Mesopotamian plain depressing. If true, it would be one of history's most romantic gestures, a king creating an artificial mountain paradise to comfort his homesick bride. Whether or not they existed exactly as described, the Hanging Gardens became symbolic of Babylon's wealth and splendor. The city that Nebuchadnezzar built was a marvel of urban planning and engineering. It had a sophisticated water supply system, drawing from the Euphrates which flowed through the city. Canals brought water to different districts. The city had paved streets, a rarity in the ancient world. It had administrative efficiency, with scribes recording everything from temple offerings to workers' rations on thousands of clay tablets. It had bustling markets where goods from across the empire and beyond were traded. It was, by the standards of its time, a metropolis, home to perhaps 200,000 people, an enormous population for the ancient world. But Babylon was more than just a wealthy and beautiful city. It was a center of learning and culture. Its scribal schools taught not only literacy but mathematics, astronomy, literature, and law. The great libraries, particularly those attached to temples, held thousands of tablets preserving the accumulated wisdom of Mesopotamian civilization, literary texts, scientific observations, mathematical calculations, medical recipes, divination manuals, and historical records. Babylonian scholars studied the movements of the stars and planets with painstaking precision, recording observations that would eventually contribute to Greek astronomy. They developed sophisticated mathematical techniques, solving problems that wouldn't be addressed in Europe until the Renaissance. The Babylonian calendar, with its 12 lunar months and periodic intercalary months to keep the calendar aligned with the solar year, was adopted across the Near East. Babylonian astrology, the belief that celestial events could predict earthly ones, spread throughout the ancient world and ultimately influenced Western astrology. The zodiac, dividing the sky into 12 signs, was a Babylonian development. Many of the constellation names we use today have Babylonian origins. Literature flourished under the patronage of temples and palace. Old myths were recopied with care and reverence, preserving ancient wisdom for future generations, and new compositions created that reflected Babylonian concerns and values. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic that tells how Marduk defeated the chaos monster Tiamat and created the world from her corpse, splitting her body like a shellfish to form heaven and earth, was recited during the New Year festival, reinforcing Marduk's supremacy and Babylon's central place in the cosmic order. The Epic of Gilgamesh, that ancient Sumerian story of a king who sought immortality and learned to accept mortality instead, one of humanity's oldest surviving works of literature, existed in a standard Babylonian version widely copied and read in scribal schools throughout Mesopotamia and beyond. This wasn't just a Babylonian story anymore. It was international literature, known and copied in places as distant as the Hittite capital in Anatolia and the Egyptian city of Amarna. Hymns praised the gods in elaborate, beautiful language, describing their power, their mercy, their role in maintaining cosmic order. Prayers asked for their favor in matters both great and small, from success in battle to relief from toothache, from the birth of healthy children to protection from demons that were believed to cause illness. Proverbs collected wisdom earned through hard experience, offering practical advice that sounds surprisingly familiar even today. Don't travel in the desert alone, one proverb warns. A single reed doesn't give enough shade. Another advises skepticism of easy promises. Calling a thing good doesn't make it good. These kernels of practical wisdom were copied by scribal students who learned not just to write, but to think, to question, to observe the world carefully. Love songs, lullabies, drinking songs, and work songs show that Babylonian culture wasn't all high seriousness, law codes and religious texts. People celebrated, mourned, fell in love, raised children, got drunk at festivals, complained about their work, and found joy in music and poetry, just as people everywhere have always done. One drinking song celebrates beer, praising it as the gift of the goddess Ninkasi, while noting humorously that excessive consumption leads to predictable problems. A lullaby addresses a crying baby with the tenderness of a parent anywhere, promising rest and comfort. These texts humanize the Babylonians in a way that royal inscriptions and law codes never could, reminding us that beneath the grand narratives of kings and conquests, ordinary people lived their lives much as we do. Trade flourished under Nebuchadnezzar's long reign and the peace and stability it brought. Merchants traveled far and wide, their caravans moving along routes that had been used for centuries but were now safer than they had been in generations. These merchants brought luxury goods to Babylon's markets, creating a cosmopolitan atmosphere where goods from across the known world could be found. Caravans loaded with goods crossed the Syrian desert, connecting Mesopotamia to the Mediterranean coast where Phoenician cities traded goods from across that sea. Cedar wood came from Lebanon, its aromatic timber prized for building temples and palaces. Purple dye, extracted painstakingly from sea snails by Phoenician craftsmen, arrived to color the robes of the wealthy. Wine came from the hills of Syria and the valleys of Anatolia, a luxury drink for special occasions since beer was the everyday beverage of Mesopotamia. Ships sailed the Persian Gulf, connecting Babylonia to the Arabian Peninsula, to the Persian coast, and ultimately to India and perhaps beyond, following trade routes that stretched back to Sumerian times. These ships brought exotic goods, incense from Arabia, particularly frankincense and myrrh, the aromatic resins burned in temples and used in perfumes. Spices came from the east, flavors to enliven food and medicine. Pearls and precious shells were harvested from the Gulf waters. Perhaps most importantly, these maritime routes brought metals. Copper came from Oman on the Arabian Peninsula, or from Cyprus in the Mediterranean. Tin, essential for making bronze and probably coming originally from Afghanistan or Central Asia, reached Babylonia through this complex network of trade. The empire's prosperity was reflected in the diversity of goods available in its markets, a testament to the reach of Babylonian commerce. Within the city, skilled craftsmen produced goods that combined utility with beauty. Jewelry makers created intricate pieces using gold and silver, adorning them with precious stones like lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, carnelian from India, and turquoise from Persia. These weren't mass-produced trinkets but individual works of art, each piece carefully crafted. Ivory carvers created decorative panels for furniture, often depicting scenes of royal hunts or religious ceremonies, working the elephant tusks that came from either Syria or more likely India. Textile workers produced fine woolens, Mesopotamia's great export product. Babylonian textiles were renowned for their quality and color. The wool came from sheep carefully bred for the purpose, shorn, spun into thread, woven into cloth, then dyed with vegetable and mineral pigments to create garments in colors ranging from rich reds to deep blues to brilliant yellows. A fine woolen garment from Babylon was a status symbol throughout the ancient Near East. Glazed ceramics were another Babylonian specialty. The techniques for creating colored glazes that could be fired onto brick or pottery had been perfected over centuries. The brilliant blue bricks of the Ishtar Gate were the most spectacular example, but the technique was used for everything from decorative tiles to storage jars to household pottery. The chemistry involved in creating these glazes, mixing minerals to produce specific colors and textures, was sophisticated and carefully guarded by craftsmen who passed their knowledge from master to apprentice. Babylonian workmanship was prized throughout the ancient world, exported not just as finished goods but as expertise. Babylonian craftsmen were sometimes recruited by foreign kings to build and decorate palaces, spreading Babylonian artistic influence far beyond the empire's borders. Mathematics in Babylon reached levels that would not be matched in Europe until well into the medieval period. The Babylonian number system, using base 60 rather than the base 10 we use today, might seem strange to us, but it was actually highly practical. 60 has many divisors, making it easy to work with fractions, and this sexagesimal system is why we still divide hours into 60 minutes and minutes into 60 seconds. Why circles have 360 degrees divided into 60-minute arcs. Babylonian mathematicians could perform complex calculations. They understood the concept of place value, something that would take European mathematics many more centuries to develop. They created multiplication tables, reciprocal tables, and tables of squares and cubes that scribal students memorized and used. They could solve what we would call quadratic equations, problems involving unknown values raised to the second power. They understood the Pythagorean theorem, the relationship between the sides of a right triangle, more than 1,000 years before Pythagoras was born. Clay tablets survive showing calculations of areas and volumes, essential for assessing taxes on fields or calculating how much grain a storage container could hold. They had formulas for calculating compound interest on loans, for dividing inheritances, for surveying land. Some of their mathematical knowledge was practical, applied to everyday problems, but some went beyond immediate utility, showing mathematical curiosity about numerical patterns and relationships for their own sake, the beginning of mathematics as a science rather than just a tool. Astronomy was perhaps the area where Babylonian science achieved its greatest heights. The Babylonians were patient, systematic observers of the night sky, motivated partly by practical concerns like knowing when to plant and harvest, but also by religious beliefs that the movements of celestial bodies reflected divine will and could predict earthly events. They divided the sky into recognizable constellations, many of which we still use today, and tracked the movements of the 5 visible planets: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, the wandering stars that moved against the background of fixed constellations. They kept detailed observational records, dating specific astronomical events to specific dates in their calendar. Some of these records, preserved on clay tablets, span many decades or even centuries of continuous observation. They noticed patterns, that Venus appears as both morning and evening star on a predictable cycle, that lunar eclipses occur in patterns, that the planets sometimes appear to move backward against the stars in what we call retrograde motion. By tracking these patterns over long periods, they could make predictions. They developed mathematical models that could predict the positions of planets months or even years in advance with impressive accuracy. Their achievements in predicting eclipses were particularly notable. Through centuries of patient observation and record-keeping, Babylonian astronomers discovered patterns in when eclipses occurred. By analyzing these patterns, astronomers working in the later Babylonian period, around 300 years before the Common Era, identified what we now call the Saros cycle, a period of roughly 18 years after which eclipse patterns repeat. The observations and mathematical foundations for this discovery were accumulated over many generations of Babylonian stargazing, creating a database that made such predictions possible. Using this knowledge, late Babylonian astronomers could predict when eclipses would occur, a power that must have seemed almost magical to those who didn't understand the mathematics involved. These astronomical achievements would later influence Greek astronomy profoundly. When Greek scholars came to Mesopotamia after Alexander's conquests, they found centuries of observational data that awed them. Greek astronomers like Hipparchus and Ptolemy built their own models of celestial mechanics using Babylonian data as their foundation. Medicine in Babylon combined observation, practical experience, and religious belief in ways that seem strange to modern thinking but made sense in their worldview. Physicians diagnosed illnesses, prescribed treatments using herbs and minerals, performed surgery including procedures like trephination, drilling holes in the skull to relieve pressure. Medical texts preserved on clay tablets list symptoms, diagnoses, and treatments for various ailments. But illness was often understood as having both natural and supernatural causes. Disease might come from bad food or bad air, but it might also come from demonic possession or divine punishment for sin. Treatment therefore combined what we would call medicine with what we would call magic. A physician might prescribe a plant-based remedy to reduce fever, while also recommending specific prayers or rituals to appease the offended deity or drive out the possessing demon. Amulets were worn to protect against illness. Incantations were recited during medical procedures. This wasn't ignorance or superstition, at least not entirely. It was a coherent system of understanding health and illness that acknowledged multiple possible causes and employed multiple approaches to healing. Some Babylonian remedies, when analyzed by modern pharmacologists, turn out to have genuine medical value. Others clearly didn't, relying on sympathetic magic or religious belief. But the systematic approach to recording symptoms and treatments, the recognition that different illnesses require different treatments, these were important steps in the development of medicine as a systematic practice. Nebuchadnezzar's reign was long and successful, 43 years of power and prosperity. But even the greatest of kings must eventually die. When Nebuchadnezzar died in 562 years before the Common Era, he left behind an empire at the height of its power, a capital city without rival, and a legacy that would echo through the ages. But he also left a political succession that would prove far more fragile than his building projects. The final decades of Babylonian independence were marked by instability and increasingly strange behavior from its rulers. After Nebuchadnezzar's death in 562 years before the Common Era, the throne passed to his son Amel-Marduk, whom the Bible calls Evil Merodach. His reign was brief, lasting only 2 years before he was murdered in a palace coup. The circumstances are murky, but opposition from powerful nobles and priests seems to have been involved. He was replaced by Neriglissar, who may have been his brother-in-law and was certainly involved in the conspiracy that killed him. Neriglissar ruled for 4 years, from 559 to 556 years before the Common Era. He was a capable administrator and launched military campaigns to Syria to maintain Babylonian control there, but he died in 556, possibly of natural causes. His young son Labashi-Marduk inherited the throne but lasted only a few months before being overthrown by another conspiracy. This time, the throne went to someone not of royal blood, a man named Nabonidus. Nabonidus remains one of the most controversial and enigmatic figures in ancient Near Eastern history. He came from the city of Haran in northern Mesopotamia, and his mother had been a priestess of the moon god Sin. Some sources suggest she may have been a member of the old Assyrian nobility. Nabonidus himself had served in high administrative positions under Nebuchadnezzar and his successors. He was probably in his 60s when he took the throne, positioning himself as a restorer of proper order after the chaos of multiple coups. But his reign, which lasted from 556 to 539 years before the Common Era, would prove deeply divisive. The problem was religion. Nabonidus was a devoted worshipper of Sin, the moon god, whom he considered supreme among the gods. This wouldn't necessarily have been problematic. Various kings had favored different deities, but Nabonidus seemed to go further, elevating Sin above even Marduk, Babylon's patron god and the deity whose supremacy had been carefully cultivated for centuries. The priests of Marduk, powerful and influential, viewed this with alarm and growing hostility. Worse, Nabonidus left Babylon. For reasons still debated by scholars, he departed the capital and spent about 10 years in the Arabian oasis city of Tama, more than 500 miles to the southwest. He left his son Belshazzar, whom the Bible would later call Balthazar, to serve as regent in Babylon, but he himself remained in Tama. Various explanations have been proposed for this unprecedented behavior. Perhaps he was pursuing trade opportunities, trying to control the lucrative Arabian incense routes that brought frankincense and myrrh from southern Arabia to Mediterranean markets. Perhaps he was seeking to spread the worship of Sin, establishing new cult centers far from the conservative Babylonian priesthood. Perhaps he was fleeing from illness, either physical or mental, or from some political crisis in Babylon that made the capital unsafe for him. The ancient sources don't tell us clearly, leaving us to piece together possibilities from fragmentary evidence. But regardless of his motivations, his absence from the capital was unprecedented and scandalous. During the years Nabonidus was away, the New Year festival couldn't be properly celebrated because the king's presence was required for the rituals. This was religiously problematic and politically damaging. The priests of Marduk grew increasingly alienated. Propaganda texts written by or for them portray Nabonidus as impious, mad, and unfit to rule. One text claims he had disturbing dreams and couldn't sleep. Another says he built temples to false gods. A third suggests he was stricken with an unclean skin disease. Whether any of this was true or pure propaganda is impossible to say, but it reveals how deeply his support had eroded among the Babylonian religious establishment. While Babylon was distracted by its strange king, a new power was rising to the east. The Medes, who had been Babylon's allies against Assyria, had themselves been overthrown. A Persian king named Cyrus, from the ruling family of Persis in what's now southwestern Iran, had rebelled against his Median overlord Astyages and defeated him around 550 years before the Common Era. Cyrus united the Medes and Persians under his rule and quickly began building an empire of his own. He conquered Lydia in Anatolia, defeating the wealthy king Croesus in 546 years before the Common Era. He expanded Persian control eastward into Central Asia, and gradually, Babylon's great rival and eventual nemesis came into focus. By the time Nabonidus finally returned to Babylon around 543 or 542 years before the Common Era, the Persian threat was obvious. Cyrus controlled a vast empire, stretching from the Aegean Sea to the borders of India. Babylon stood alone. Egypt was weak and divided. The small states of the Levant couldn't provide meaningful support. Diplomatic isolation combined with Nabonidus's domestic unpopularity left Babylon vulnerable. In 539 years before the Common Era, Cyrus moved against Babylon. What happened next is extraordinary, though the exact details are contested by our sources. There was no great siege of the kind Babylon's massive walls seemed designed to withstand. Contemporary Babylonian sources, including the Nabonidus Chronicle, state that the city was taken without battle, suggesting that the city itself fell peacefully. However, this doesn't mean the conquest was entirely bloodless. The same chronicle records a major battle at Opis, north of Babylon on the Tigris River, where Persian forces defeated the Babylonian army with significant casualties. After this defeat, resistance seems to have collapsed. According to the Cyrus cylinder, a clay cylinder inscribed with Persian propaganda, Cyrus entered Babylon peacefully, invited in by Marduk himself, who was displeased with Nabonidus's impiety. The text presents Cyrus as a liberator restoring proper worship. According to the Greek historian Herodotus, writing much later and relying on oral traditions, the Persians diverted the Euphrates River and entered the city along the riverbed, while the Babylonians were distracted by a festival, catching them by surprise. The truth likely combines elements from these sources. Some Babylonians, particularly the priests of Marduk who hated Nabonidus, probably did facilitate the Persian conquest, opening gates or providing intelligence. Persian military forces entered the city on October 12, 539, meeting little organized resistance. There may have been a brief battle in which Belshazzar, defending the city or the palace, was killed, an event remembered in the biblical book of Daniel with its story of Belshazzar's feast and the writing on the wall, though that account mingles historical memory with theological interpretation. Cyrus had learned the value of mercy in propaganda. He presented himself not as a foreign conqueror but as a liberator, restoring proper worship of Marduk, ending Nabonidus's supposed crimes. The Cyrus cylinder, one of ancient history's most famous artifacts, preserves Cyrus's official version of events. In it, he claims that Marduk had searched for a righteous king to restore justice and found him, Cyrus, king of Anshan, far to the east. Marduk had called him to march against Babylon and deliver it from Nabonidus's misrule. Cyrus claimed to have entered the city peacefully, with no fighting, and to have immediately begun reversing Nabonidus's policies, restoring temples, returning God's statues to their proper homes, and releasing peoples who had been held captive. This last point particularly impressed the Jews exiled in Babylon. Cyrus permitted them to return to Judah and even provided funds to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. 2nd Isaiah, the later portion of the biblical book of Isaiah, was written during this period and hails Cyrus as the Lord's anointed, a Messiah figure despite being a pagan king, because he freed the exiles. For the Jews, Cyrus became a heroic figure. For the Babylonians who opposed Nabonidus, he was a liberator. For the priests of Marduk, he was a king who showed proper respect for their god. And so Babylon passed into Persian hands not through destruction but through a kind of political absorption. Nabonidus's fate is unclear. Some sources suggest he was captured and exiled to Carmania in eastern Iran, where he died. He would be the last native Mesopotamian king. Babylon itself would continue as a great city, one of the capitals of the Persian Empire, but it would never again be independent. The Neo-Babylonian Empire, which had risen from the ashes of Assyrian domination and flourished so brilliantly under Nebuchadnezzar, had lasted less than a century. It was 539 years before the Common Era. After more than 3,000 years, Mesopotamian independence had ended. Yet Babylon as a city didn't immediately decline. Under Persian rule, it remained one of the great urban centers of the ancient world. The Achaemenid Persian emperors used it as one of their capitals, spending part of each year there. They maintained its temples and presented themselves as legitimate successors to the Babylonian kings, taking the traditional Babylonian royal titles and participating in the New Year festival. Cyrus's son Cambyses and his successor Darius the Great both honored Babylonian traditions, but there were rebellions. The Babylonians weren't entirely reconciled to foreign rule. In 522 years before the Common Era, during a crisis following Cambyses' death, a man claiming to be a son of Nabonidus seized power briefly. Darius had to reconquer the city. Again in 482 years before the Common Era, under Darius's son Xerxes, Babylon rebelled. This time, Persian retribution was harsher. The city walls were torn down, some temples were damaged or demolished. The statue of Marduk may have been destroyed or carried away, ending the ancient ritual connection between God and city. The New Year festival couldn't be celebrated without it. Babylon never fully recovered from this blow. Though it remained a large and important city, its days as a center of political power were over. When Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire in the 330s and 320s before the Common Era, he visited Babylon and was impressed by what remained. He planned to make it his capital and ordered repairs to the great ziggurat et Emenanke, but he died in Babylon in 323 years before the Common Era, possibly of malaria or poison, before he could implement these plans. After Alexander's death, his empire was divided among his generals. Babylon fell to Seleucus, who founded the Seleucid Empire. But Seleucus built a new capital, Seleucia, on the Tigris, just 40 miles from Babylon. Many of Babylon's inhabitants were moved to this new city. Babylon itself began a long, slow decline. By the 1st century before the Common Era, the geographer Strabo reported that it was largely abandoned. The great city gradually became a ruin, its bricks quarried for building materials, its canals silting up, its temples crumbling. For centuries, the ruins lay largely forgotten, covered by wind-blown sand. Local people called the main mound Babil, and knew vaguely that it had once been an important place, but the details were lost. Babylon survived in memory, preserved in the Hebrew Bible's denunciations of its power and its sin, in Greek histories that described its wonders, and in its role as the archetypal city of worldly power, and eventually in Christian thought of worldly corruption. The whore of Babylon in the book of Revelation is Babylon transformed into a symbol of everything opposed to the divine city. It wasn't until the 19th century that Babylon began to be rediscovered, not as a symbol but as an actual historical place that could be excavated, studied, and understood through archaeological methods that were just being developed. European archaeologists, particularly German teams led by Robert Koldewey, who excavated from 1899 to 1917, began systematic excavation of the ruins. This wasn't treasure hunting but scientific archaeology, carefully recording find spots, preserving fragile materials, and documenting everything they discovered. What they found transformed our understanding not just of Babylon but of ancient Mesopotamia as a whole. They uncovered the Ishtar Gate, Fort Dalazans, that magnificent structure whose blue-glazed bricks had somehow survived millennia buried in the earth. The process of excavation was painstaking. Each brick had to be carefully removed, numbered, and preserved. The Germans eventually reconstructed the gate in Berlin's Pergamon Museum using many of the original bricks supplemented by carefully made reproductions, creating one of that museum's most spectacular displays. Visitors today can walk through the gate and down a section of the processional way, seeing what visitors to ancient Babylon would have seen, those brilliant blue walls decorated with golden lions and dragons, and experiencing at least a hint of the city's former magnificence. They excavated the processional way itself, that broad avenue that had led to the heart of the city. They mapped the city's layout, identifying temples, palaces, residential districts, discovering how the ancient city had been organized. They found the foundations of Nebuchadnezzar's palace and traced the outlines of what might have been the Hanging Gardens, though that identification remains controversial. They located the remains of ziggurats, those stepped temple towers that had dominated the skyline. Though the brick superstructures had long since been quarried away, the foundations remained, allowing archaeologists to calculate the original dimensions and imagine how these structures must have appeared. But perhaps their most important discovery was neither buildings nor treasures but information. Thousands upon thousands of clay tablets inscribed with cuneiform text. These tablets, preserved by Babylon's dry climate and by the fact that clay, unlike papyrus or parchment, survives well underground, proved to be an unparalleled archive of information about every aspect of Babylonian life. There were royal inscriptions, kings boasting of their achievements in language designed to impress gods and men alike. There were administrative records, the mundane paperwork of empire, tax assessments, ration lists, work assignments. There were contracts documenting loans, sales, marriages, divorces, adoptions, legal agreements of every sort. There were letters, both official correspondence between kings and personal notes between family members or business partners. There were literary texts, copies of ancient epics and hymns and prayers. There were scientific texts recording astronomical observations, mathematical calculations, medical diagnoses and treatments. These tablets had to be cleaned, catalogued, translated, a process that continues to this day. Many remain unpublished, sitting in museum storerooms awaiting scholars with the time and expertise to read them. Each one potentially contains new information, new insights into Babylonian civilization. Slowly, painstakingly, scholars learn to read cuneiform again, a skill that had been lost for nearly 2,000 years. The decipherment of cuneiform, achieved in the mid-19th century by scholars working with inscriptions from Persia and Mesopotamia, opened this vast archive to modern understanding. Suddenly, Babylonians could speak to us directly through their own writings, not filtered through Greek or Roman historians or biblical authors, but in their own voices, expressing their own concerns in their own words. The work continues today, though sadly, much of Babylon's archaeological heritage has been damaged by recent conflicts in Iraq. The ancient city, lying in central Iraq near the modern town of Hilla, has suffered from war, looting, and well-intentioned but destructive reconstruction attempts. Coalition forces built a military base on the site during the Iraq War, causing damage with heavy vehicles and construction. Saddam Hussein had earlier undertaken reconstruction projects that, while meant to celebrate Iraq's heritage, used modern materials and methods that weren't authentic and sometimes damaged underlying ancient remains. UNESCO has designated the site as a World Heritage Site, recognizing both its importance and its vulnerability, and international organizations work to preserve what remains and to protect the site from further damage. Still, what has been recovered has revolutionized our understanding of ancient Mesopotamia in ways that earlier generations could barely imagine. We can now read Hammurabi's laws in his own words, exactly as they were written on that great stone stele nearly 4,000 years ago. We can follow the accounting of temple economies, seeing how priests managed vast agricultural estates and tracking every bushel of barley and jar of oil. We can read letters between kings, eavesdropping on diplomatic negotiations conducted 3 millennia ago. We can recite the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Enuma Elish as Babylonians once did, hearing stories that were already ancient when Homer composed the Iliad. The Babylonians, who vanished from history as an independent people 2,500 years ago, speak to us again across that vast gulf of time. And what do they tell us? What is the legacy of Babylon, of this civilization that flourished in the desert between 2 rivers, reaching heights of power and sophistication before falling to foreign conquest and eventually fading into legend? It's vast and profound, touching nearly every aspect of Western civilization in ways both obvious and subtle, though often unrecognized except by specialists. The Babylonians and their Mesopotamian predecessors were pioneers, working out solutions to fundamental human challenges that later civilizations would build upon. When we divide the day into 24 hours, each hour into 60 minutes, each minute into 60 seconds, we're using a system developed by Babylonian mathematicians who appreciated the mathematical elegance of base 60. When we divide the circle into 360 degrees, we're following Babylonian practice that emerged from their astronomical observations. The zodiac, those 12 signs through which the sun passes during the year, each associated with specific constellations and given symbolic meanings, is Babylonian in origin. Western astrology, with its complex system of planetary influences and celestial predictions, descends directly from Babylonian astrology, though modified and elaborated by Greek and Roman thinkers. Even skeptics who dismiss astrology as superstition are using a system of timekeeping and celestial division that the Babylonians created. Babylonian mathematics was remarkably sophisticated for its time, and in some ways more sophisticated than what came later in the West for many centuries. They understood the concept of place value, where a digit's position determines its value, essential for performing complex calculations. This wouldn't appear in European mathematics until the medieval period, when it arrived from India, though it may have ultimately derived from even earlier Mesopotamian concepts. They could solve quadratic equations. They understood the Pythagorean theorem a millennium before Pythagoras. They created mathematical tables and used them to perform calculations that seem impossibly complex without modern computing tools. Clay tablets survive, showing calculations of astonishing sophistication, demonstrating that Babylonian scribes were doing advanced mathematics 3,500 years ago. In law, Hammurabi's code influenced legal thinking throughout the ancient Near East and indirectly influenced legal development in Western civilization. The principle that punishment should fit the crime, that there should be public standards of justice accessible to all rather than arbitrary authority, that the strong should not be allowed to oppress the weak merely because they can. These ideas, carved on that great stone stele nearly 4,000 years ago, echo through legal history. Many of the specific laws in the Torah, particularly in the Book of Exodus, which contains the Covenant Code, and in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, show clear structural and thematic similarities to Mesopotamian legal traditions. The Jews, who spent 2 generations in Babylonian exile during the 6th century before the Common Era, absorbed much from their captors even while maintaining their own distinct identity and religious uniqueness. Literature too shows Babylonian influence. The story of the flood in Genesis, with Noah and his ark, is strikingly similar to the flood story in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where a hero named Utnapishtim builds a boat to survive divine-sent floodwaters. Biblical stories of the creation, of Babel's tower reaching toward heaven, of Babylon as a great and wicked city, all show deep engagement with Mesopotamian tradition. Even after Babylon fell, its literary legacy lived on. Urban planning, architecture, irrigation, these were all areas where Babylonian achievements were remarkable. The great ziggurats, which inspired the Tower of Babel's story, were architectural marvels. Massive structures built without mortar, using only mud, brick, and bitumen, yet lasting for millennia. The complex systems of canals that brought water to fields and cities required sophisticated engineering and constant maintenance. Babylonian cities were planned spaces, not random settlements, with different districts for different functions, with defensive walls and gates, with temples as administrative and economic centers as well as religious ones. Religion is perhaps the most complex part of the legacy. The Babylonian pantheon, with its many gods governing different aspects of existence, influenced the religious thinking of neighboring peoples. The Jews in exile encountered Babylonian theology and reacted against it, emphasizing their own monotheism more strongly precisely because they were surrounded by polytheism. Early Christianity, developing in a world still influenced by Babylonian ideas filtered through Greek and Roman culture, both absorbed and rejected elements of this tradition. The 7-day week, for example, has roots in Babylonian astronomy and astrology, with each day associated with one of the 7 celestial bodies known to the ancients. Even the concept of empire, of a single power ruling diverse peoples across a vast territory, owes much to Babylonian precedent. Hammurabi's unification of Mesopotamia provided a model. Nebuchadnezzar's Neo-Babylonian Empire, though shorter-lived, demonstrated how effective administration, monumental building projects, and careful management of both force and symbolic power could maintain control. The Persians, who conquered Babylon, learned from it, adopting many of its administrative practices. The model would pass from Persia to Alexander's Macedonians, from them to the Seleucids, and ultimately influence Roman imperial administration. Perhaps most fundamentally, Babylon represents humanity's first successful experiment in creating complex civilization. The challenge of organizing thousands of people in cities, of feeding them through irrigated agriculture, of maintaining order through law rather than simple force, of preserving and transmitting knowledge through writing, of creating art and literature, of understanding the world through observation and mathematics. All of this was worked out first in Mesopotamia. Babylon was the heir to this tradition and one of its greatest expressions. It showed that human beings could create enduring civilizations, could build cities that lasted not just years but millennia, could develop knowledge that would serve humanity for ages to come. The fall of Babylon as an independent power didn't end its influence. Ideas, once released into the world, have a way of surviving long after the civilizations that created them have vanished. Trade routes carried Babylonian goods but also Babylonian ideas. Scholars in distant lands studied Babylonian texts. Merchants used Babylonian mathematics. Priests and scribes in Egypt, in Persia, in Greece, encountered Babylonian knowledge and built upon it. When Greek scholars came to the Near East following Alexander's conquests, they found Babylonian astronomical observations that awed them. These observations, some dating back many centuries, provided data that Greek astronomers like Hipparchus and Ptolemy used to develop their own astronomical theories. The precision and systematic nature of Babylonian record-keeping impressed the Greeks. They had philosophy and theoretical thinking, but the Babylonians had centuries of patient observation, a different kind of knowledge but equally valuable. The Renaissance, that great rebirth of classical learning in Europe, recovered not just Greek and Roman texts, but, through Islamic scholars who had preserved them, Babylonian mathematical techniques, the use of algebraic methods, the understanding of mathematical astronomy. These reached Europe, partly through the Islamic world, which had itself learned from Babylonian traditions preserved by their Persian and later Christian and Jewish scholars in Mesopotamia. Even today, archaeological work continues to reveal new aspects of Babylonian civilization. Thousands of cuneiform tablets remain untranslated, sitting in museums around the world. Each one potentially contains new information about how Babylonians lived, worked, worshipped, and thought. The conversation with this ancient civilization isn't over. New discoveries, new translations, new interpretations continue to deepen our understanding. What's striking is how human the Babylonians appear in their texts. Reading their letters, we find people worried about money, about their children, about their health. Reading their contracts, we see the mundane details of economic life, loans and interest rates, rental agreements, employment contracts. Reading their literature, we find familiar emotions, love and loss, ambition and disappointment, faith and doubt. The Epic of Gilgamesh, that ancient story of a king who sought immortality and learned to accept mortality instead, speaks to human concerns as relevant today as 4,000 years ago. The Babylonians grappled with the great questions: why do we suffer? What happens after death? How should we live? What do the gods want from us? How can we find meaning in a world that often seems chaotic and unjust? Their answers were different from ours, shaped by their culture and their worldview, but the questions themselves are eternal. In that sense, studying Babylon isn't just learning about the past, it's encountering an earlier chapter of the human story, seeing how our ancestors dealt with challenges both like and unlike our own. There's a poignancy in contemplating Babylon's ruins, this city that was once the wonder of the world, that housed the Hanging Gardens, that saw Nebuchadnezzar's triumphs and Nabonidus' strange reign, that witnessed the beginning of the Jewish diaspora and the end of Mesopotamian independence, now exists only as mounds of earth and brick in the Iraqi desert. The great ziggurat is gone, quarried away centuries ago. The Ishtar Gate, or at least its surviving facing, stands reconstructed in a museum in Berlin. The palace where Alexander the Great died is a confusion of ruined walls and foundations. Time has been unkind to Babylon's physical remains, yet in another sense, Babylon lives on. Every time we use the number 60, every time we look at a clock or a compass, every time we read about Noah's flood or the Tower of Babel, every time we study astronomy or mathematics or law, we're touching something that reaches back to those scribes in their temple schools, pressing their styluses into soft clay, recording observations and calculations and stories. The clay tablets were more durable than we often realize. Many have survived 2,500 years or more. The ideas carved into them have survived even longer. So when we ask what happened to the Babylonians, the answer is complex. As a political entity, as an independent civilization, they ended 25 centuries ago when Cyrus entered their city and made it part of a Persian empire. As a people speaking their language and worshipping their gods, they gradually faded over the following centuries, absorbed into successive empires, their distinct identity lost. The last known cuneiform text dates to 75 years into the Common Era. After that, the script, the writing system that had served Mesopotamia for 3,000 years, fell silent. The temples closed, the gods were forgotten, their names surviving only in texts no one could read. But as a legacy, as a foundation stone of human civilization, the Babylonians never truly ended. They live on in us, in the ways we measure and calculate, in legal principles we take for granted, in stories that have been retold and reimagined countless times. They live on in the very concept of the city as humanity's great cooperative achievement. They live on every time we look up at the night sky and call the constellation patterns by names that descend through Latin and Greek from Babylonian astronomy. The story of Babylon is ultimately a human story, the story of people who looked at a harsh and unforgiving environment and decided to transform it, to build cities and empires, to create art and literature, to unlock the secrets of mathematics and astronomy, to establish laws and try to create justice. They succeeded brilliantly. They also failed, their empire crumbling, their independence lost, their civilization eventually vanishing. But what they built, what they learned, what they created, that didn't vanish. It changed form, passing from them to Persians, to Greeks, to Romans, to medieval Islamic scholars, to Renaissance Europeans, to us. When we read about Hammurabi establishing that the strong should not oppress the weak, when we contemplate Nebuchadnezzar's ambition to make Babylon the greatest city in the world, when we consider the scribes patiently recording their observations of the stars night after night over generations, when we read the ancient Sumerian proverb that opens one of their wisdom texts, "He who works in the reed marsh shall not smell sweet," a wry acknowledgement that hard, muddy work is necessary, even if unglamorous, we're encountering minds not so different from our own. These were people trying to make sense of their world, to leave something lasting, to matter. And they did matter. They still matter. The roads they built are dust. The walls they raised are rubble. The gardens they planted, if they existed, are long dead. But something of Babylon endures in every civilized society that has come after, in every city that rises proudly with its walls and towers, in every code of laws that tries to bring order to human affairs, in every moment when we look up at the night sky and recognize patterns our ancestors first named thousands of years ago. So this is the story of the Babylonians. From the marshes of ancient Sumer to Hammurabi's empire, from Kassite stability to Assyrian domination, from Nabopolassar's rebellion to Nebuchadnezzar's glory, from Nabonidus's strangeness to Cyrus's conquest, and from there into memory and legacy. They were a great civilization, perhaps the first great civilization, and though they're gone, they're not forgotten. They can't be forgotten. We carry them with us, in ways both obvious and subtle, every day. If you've found this journey through Babylonian history fascinating, please consider hitting the like button and subscribing to the channel. There are many more stories waiting to be told, many more civilizations to explore, many more voices from the past that deserve to be heard. Until next time, sleep well, and remember that history isn't just about the past, it's about understanding who we are and where we came from. Good night.